Good morning. This is the second part of Chapter 23 screencast. The first was on Hardy-Weinberg and how to solve for the Hardy-Weinberg formula. And as a recap of that, remember that the characteristics to meet the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium are all about not having natural selection happen. And then the rest of Chapter 23 goes on with what does cause natural selection. And the first thing that they talk about is the four big factors after you've gone past Hardy-Weinberg, the four factors that are responsible for natural selection: genetic drift, the founder effect, the bottleneck effect, and gene flow. And although I've tried this many times before and it doesn't really work all that well, these are your four. And I'm going to go through each separately. And there are a couple that are really very similar to each other. So in genetic drift, it has to do with a very small population, and something happens to it, and sometimes it's fairly minimal and sometimes it's not so minimal. So in one case of the book gives you I don't think it's the best example that they can give you, is that a moose could step on a certain population of flowers and that could affect the gene population. And again, it might help for you as I go through this to look at the notes that I've also put on Google Classroom that go through the major characteristics of the four different factors, the major factors that can cause natural selection. So the big one with genetic drift is it happens in a small population, and that there are chance events that happen, and oftentimes those are not quite catastrophes. What is happening a lot is those chance events aren't so chance, it's human population. So the strong beaver population in Wisconsin was damaged by a Walmart. They actually chose to put several different Walmarts in the state neighboring streams, and it was felt initially the property was fairly inexpensive because it tended to flood, and so part of the deal was that they were going to start preventing the floodplain there, which would help other parts of the community. It was not the floodplain issue, it was that there was a very large beaver population that as soon as anyone was clearing their little dams, they were very strategically rebuilding them. And so Walmart actually lost one of their battles. They had built the entire facility, and the beavers kept coming back and rebuilding, and the long-term effect was an entire flooded parking lot, and environmentalists and regulations and the game wardens, etc. It was the beavers' property, and so usually the beavers lose out, but in this case Walmart gave in and just built a different parking lot. So that was chance events that really had the ability to change the population there. Other chance events would be, if you go back to Honor's Option, we had the case of the Great Prairie Chicken. And then again, human population decimated as the people immigrated to the prairie. They brought chickens that ended up always getting, genetic variation between the natural population and the new population of chickens. So that reduced the actual amount of prairie chickens that were true natives. And then the other chance events that were studied in that case study, if you remember, when they went in and looked at the population, the other factor was the prairie land was greatly reduced by human population. And then the final factor, the tipping point for the Great Prairie Chicken, was that heavy rains happened over 3 springs. So that's a chance event. And so that did a lot of things. It led to a reduced amount of allele frequency. We know that they were already compromised by other types of chickens coming into their population. Chance events, they already had a very small population. And unfortunately, we know that some of the males had not very strong allele frequencies, and so even though they were mating, they were not populating and getting a good egg lock count, because remember that LOK for their population of their nests. So genetic drift, one of the best examples Honors Option can use is the case study that we did a while ago on the Great Prairie Chicken. The second one is the founder effect, and that's always one of those ones that I kind of enjoy talking about, because it's one teenagers tend to listen to, and it's kind of funky. And so the founder effect oftentimes is isolation on purpose. I mean, that's how the United States first got populated, was the Pilgrims were being religiously persecuted, and so they decided to put all their, all of their worldly goods on a boat and sailed it across the ocean and tried to repopulate an area. And so they had a gene pool that was not all that large, other than we know from historical evidences that they quickly had children within the native population, and then other groups discovered that they had some sort of safety there, and so more population came from other countries. But two of my favorite populations to talk about are the Irish population in Chicago, because it's just so rarely known. I was in a lecture, I had gone to a medical school lecture in Virginia, and this had to have been prior to 2006, and was listening to this story that I had not known about, and that there was a rising population of sickle cell anemia individuals of a 100% Irish community in Chicago. And so when you heard the history behind this, it was actually quite intelligent. So a wealthy group of families, created their own more or less neighborhood, and they had servant issues, and they decided they would solve their servant issues by getting a boat captain to make agreement with people that they were bringing over as indentured servants. And that's how one of my relatives came over, but not to Chicago, but to Boston. And she had rather amazing journals about her trying to get out of indenturehood. But this group of wealthy people were very intelligent. They created a Catholic church for their servants. They created a small school for the children. They often admit it was for a variety of reasons, was to get the children out of the house so that their staff got more work done. They also allowed intermarriage between the founding wealthy families within this community, small community that they've created in Chicago. And that did two very strange things. Eventually, they got their own little store, and some of the children ended up not being servants, but ended up being shopkeepers. They just kept expanding their little community there. And because they were unusually happy, and because Gaelic had not been banned, and because they had set up a little health clinic, because in most communities in the United States, it was against the law to treat the Irish. Boston was one of the big cities that it was against the law to have Irish immigrants be allowed into the hospital. So people stayed, and there were generations of the Irish that stayed there because they were able to speak the language from their homeland that was banned in their country. They had wonderful health care. They had schools. They virtually had everything they needed. But all they ever did was intermarry of the population that had originally come over from the exact same village. So as a result, it was a limited gene pool. They didn't leave because they were happy. And so ended up having one of the mutations that has occurred due to that founder effect, or contiguous or inbreeding would be they have sickle cell anemia. The next is the case of the Amish in the Pennsylvania area. So I had become very close to some Amish people when I lived in Wisconsin, and was rather surprised that they shunned the Pennsylvania Dutch as being very commercial, that they live off of tourist industry. And so I was really surprised about that. You think of this as being a religious community and everyone would be on the same page. But the Wisconsin Amish, they really told me that they took great pains that in the summertime that they hired drivers to go get Amish young teenagers from Canada, from other remote areas, Minnesota, so that there could be large gatherings of the teenagers and they could find potential spouses, and they were actually increasing the gene pool. So the Pennsylvania Dutch have not done that, and so again, it was a population that came to the United States because of religious persecution, and so there were limited German families that came. And so they've ended up intermarrying first cousins many times over. And now if you see pictures of the Amish Pennsylvania Dutch and you pay attention to the fingers, many of them have 6 fingers. The question always comes up in the classroom is, are they functional? And I don't know. I would love to find that out. So again, the genetic drift is when we have chance events. The founder effect is a limited population on purpose and causing a gene, often a gene mutation. And then our bottleneck effect is the one that's by chance again, but it's not considered like genetic drift where it's a small series of events like human intervention, unnaturally wet springs for a couple years, limited allele differences in the male birds, and so they had limited egg populations. The bottleneck effect is considered to be a catastrophe event. And so the ones that I put down in the notes were hurricanes and volcanoes, because the book gives examples of both of those. And I believe in that chapter, strangely enough, one of the volcano examples they give is not listed in chapter 23. It's listed someplace else. Again, probably in natural selection and where they talk about camouflage. So with the volcano, the book gives the example of we have this island and a volcano, starts to erupt in the middle of this, and it separates 2 mice populations that end up having, allele differences over the years, mutations, variation because of where they live as being, advantages to both populations. The other one that they talk about in another chapter is where there is a volcano happens right on the edge of desert. And so we have, when the volcano erupts, we have this black obsidian glass forms, and then we have white sand. And so 2 mice populations ended up emerging somewhat like the peppered moth that just by luck had a better chance of, as they change over years of clean air in England. We saw variations in this peppered moth, the white moth with the black specks. As the air got dirtier during the Industrial Revolution, the moths that were naturally darker had the advantage, and they're the ones that survived to have more babies. And then the reverse happens after the Clean Air Act. And now with the population, the pollution being so low in the world, I'd be surprised to not see that over just one generation, that we see a whiter moth having the advantage there. Because remember, a organism does not evolve, but the population does. So in that bottleneck again, we think of a catastrophe. The other, probably how Darwin's finches first ended up populating so many different islands, and the ones that had, sort of the medium-sized beaks sort of had the big advantage in any environment. But they believe it was hurricanes that occurred that swept the population from the mainland to some of those islands. And again, there is a study in the textbook, American couple, I always remember her name was Rosemary, I never remember what his name was, but they were at the Galapagos Islands doing a multi-year study during a drought, and they saw just in 3 generations a change in the amount of birds that they saw. So the ones with the extremely large beaks that could only really successfully get large nuts in, the small seeds, they kept spilling out. The birds that could only survive off small seeds, if they found a big nut, they could do nothing with it. They discovered that in just a very short period of time, the one that had the advantage was the ones with medium-sized beaks. And when they were doing population counts of those, they found they had a much higher advantage of the medium-sized beak. And finally, with gene flow, that is when we have populations that will immigrate or emigrate with an allele that is just helpful. Mosquitoes that have become resistant to sprays. One example of that where they are migrating in their allele where they're not susceptible to sprays. That's making them immune to any kind of a insecticide. And then the other is the New York City rats that are immune to rat poison. Their population is being found further and further outside of New York City, where it was a very limited population once, and that was studied, because it was just so amazing that they would be gobbling up rat poison and nothing happening to them. We now are finding, the pest people are finding that rats that are resistant to rat poison, we're finding their population